Hello there. Tonight, we lie back and let the entire story of Greek myth move past like a calm procession by lamplight. We begin before there were names, when there was only a quiet space that people later called chaos. Out of that quiet came night, and the broad back of earth, and the deep place that kept secrets. Hills learn where to stand. The sea learned how to breathe. Nothing hurries. We will meet each thing as if it were an old neighbor and not a surprise. In time, earth raises a sky, and a family grows tall and complicated. We will visit the long years of the Titans without noise. A tool is lifted. A rule is made. Seasons learn their order. A child is hidden and fed with patient hands, and one day returns to open locked doors. Up on a new high place, the younger gods set out cups and agree to keep watch. Zeus takes the sky, Poseidon the sea, Hades the dark and steady underworld. Oaths are spoken, laws are taught. The world settles a little, the way a house settles after the builders go home. We will walk slowly along the quieter paths that run through the middle of these stories. Prometheus shapes clay and carries a small fire. Pandora lifts a lid and discovers how many words live in a single jar, and how hope chooses to remain. Demeter loses and finds her child, and teaches grain to return, spring by spring. Athena shows a city how to think with its hands. Hephaestus listens to iron. Apollo counts days. Artemis counts shadows. Hermes draws roads. Hestia keeps doorways kind. Later, heroes will cross those roads with tokens in their pockets. Perseus learns to look without looking. Theseus follows a thread and comes home by simple steps. Heracles keeps a list and lives through it, one labor at a time. At last we come to the shore where fires ring a city and a wooden shape waits for morning. Through all of it we will keep an even breath, in and out, as if turning pages in a large book that never needs to be rushed. You do not need to remember everything. The story will remember you and carry you into sleep. Before there were stories, there was a quiet without edges. Think of an open room with no walls and no floor, not empty in a frightening way, just unmeasured and patient. Later voices called it chaos. It did not roar. It did not shine. It simply allowed things to appear the way a calm surface allows a reflection. In that quiet, the first presences gathered, not with footfalls, only with a feeling that the world was getting ready to name itself. Night learned how to be a veil. Depth learned how to hold what falls. Warmth learned how to move between them like a thought. Nothing hurried. Nothing argued. It was a beginning that behaved like breathing. Earth arrived as a wide back that welcomed weight. You can picture a great table being set down so gently that dust did not rise. Ridges unfolded into place. Valleys remembered water even before water came. Stones found their corners and decided to sit still. The new ground did not ask for praise. It preferred usefulness. If you pressed a palm there, it would have felt cool and steady and willing to carry you. In the same hour, the deep place took its shape below. That was Tartarus, not a punishment yet, simply a distance so far that sound grew tired before it reached the bottom. Between the broad back and the far depth of space opened where air could practice being air. Night stepped forward and put her soft cloth over everything that was too bright to sleep. She was not the enemy of light. She was its companion, the way a lid is the companion of a jar. Her breath brought a careful darkness that did not bruise the eye. From her quiet, a second kind of shadow stood up and learned its name in the mouth. That was Erebus, the inner dark you meet behind doorways and under rafters, not dangerous, only serious. When night lifted her edge for a moment, a faint brightness answered. That was Aether, the high clean air that lives above weather. Day learned to follow this brightness the way a child follows a parent. It is easy to imagine the first sunrise not as a shout, but as a lamp turned a little higher by a steady hand. While light and shade took turns in good order, another presence moved between them like a joining. That was Eros, not an arrow, not a chase, only the quiet force that makes two things wish to be one. A root finds soil and stays. A hand finds another hand, and the fingers choose to agree. Eros did his work without speeches. Threads met and did not pull apart. From the broad back of Earth the mountains rose, not crowded, just sure. They held up the sky the way good shoulders hold a beam. A shore traced itself along the edge where land and not yet land shook hands. The sea was not a loud blue yet. It was a long breath that decided to learn rhythm. Out on those first slopes, edges became gentler. Grass practiced its small green. Brushes of thyme and rock rose found cracks and turned them into addresses. The names for all this would come later. For now the world kept to plain acts. A stone warmed under day and cooled under night. A ridge stopped the wind without complaint. The first pools listened to the first clouds and waited only as long as waiting asked. If you were standing there, you would not have felt lonely. You would have felt that the ground and the air and the dark below were already keeping each other company. From the face of earth, forms began to stand who were more than hill or wave. They were tall years gathered into persons. They were called titans, but in this first hour they were only the world speaking in clear shapes. Sky stretched above as a blue ceiling that preferred to be generous. He stood over earth not to crush her, but to give space for weather and birds. The mountains, who had always been patient, learned the pleasure of being looked up to. The sea unrolled itself and tried on a sheen that would later be called silver. Still there was no quarrel. The house was being built to hold voices, and the voices were choosing where they belonged. Night and day kept their soft exchange, and in their rhythm a calendar began without numbers. On the long plains the shadow of a single standing stone became a teacher. At noon it was short. At evening it pointed home. The high air, which had started as only a clear thought, learned to carry signs. A blush on the rim meant morning. A deepening meant rain. None of this required an audience. The world enjoyed its own order the way a good workshop enjoys a bench that stays level. If you listened, you could hear many small agreements. Do lifting, heat stepping aside, quiet filling the corners, and then stepping back to make room. Under all of this, the deep place did not complain about being deep. Tartarus kept silence the way a library keeps silence. It received what fell or what was set aside, and it did not return it in a hurry. That certainty gave courage to the ground above. Trees could risk growing tall because there was always room below for roots. Cliffs could allow a ledge to be a ledge because there was always more cliff to catch it. Even the new sea trusted its basin. It rose and fell and never feared it would run away. This is what the first myth offers before anyone speaks. It offers the comfort of structures that keep their promises even when no one is watching. When joining had done its early work and the room felt furnished, the world tried a few finer touches. Springs learned to rise with a soft pressure. Mist chose to live near them as a sister. Along the hills, small hums appeared. They were not bees yet, only the idea of gatherings. Over flat places a wandering heat practice shimmer. On high ridges a cooler ribbon showed a path for birds not yet born. The sky decided where thunder would someday live and where it would choose not to. The earth decided where vines would grip and where they would slide away. Nothing announced itself with a flourish. The large book was still on its first pages. The margins were wide. The lines were even. In this calm, the first doorways opened for stories that would need houses. There would be rooms for law and rooms for luck. There would be a corner shelf for gifts and a long hallway for journeys. The gods you have heard of were not yet seated, but there were chairs waiting that fit them. Cups waited on clean shelves. A fire ring waited for a match that had not been invented. Even a cradle shape seemed to be resting in the grain of a plank. When people later entered this house and began to give things names, they were surprised to find how much of the work had already been done by practice alone. You can lie still with this and let it pass your eyes like slow weather. Chaos was not a mess. It was a plain table. Earth was not a weight. She was a promise to carry. Night was not a fear. She was a lid that kept sweetness from drying out. Depth was not a threat. It was a place to set what should not be lost. The air above was not empty. It was a clear hallway where meaning travels, and the joining that held them together did not demand attention. It simply encouraged every boarder to behave kindly. A shore that lets the wave come close and then go. A valley that gathers wind and sends it away calmer than it arrived. By the time this first chapter of the world finished its quiet work, there were lanes you could walk with your eyes closed. Day knew where to stand. Night knew when to arrive and when to leave a little early so dawn could show off its new color. The sea had learned how to settle after a thought of storm. The ground had learned how to forgive the foot that stumbled and to welcome the foot that returned. Stories were now possible. There would be families with difficult rooms and tools that remembered the hand that used them and voices that rose and then softened. But before any of that, this was enough. A lid on a jar. A table that does not wobble. A breath that can be taken in and then let out without asking permission. If your eyes are already heavy, let them be heavy. The world is ready to carry whatever you put down. The names will come later. The faces will come later. For now you can lie with the wide back of earth under you, and the calm ceiling of sky above you, and the good deep distance below, keeping everything safe. Night will visit and step away. Day will ease back in. The joining will keep its quiet touch on all the borders. When you wake, we will walk on into the next room, where years learn to stand up and speak as people. For now the story is content to breathe, and you are allowed to breathe with it. After the first quiet rooms were furnished, the world put on taller shapes so time could have shoulders to lean on. From earth and sky came a family the old stories call the Titans. They were not storms in armor. They were long years given calm faces. Oceanus learned to be every river that returns without complaint. Tethys learned to be the kindness of springs and the way fresh water meets salt without quarrel. Hyperion carried the plain idea of light. Thea held the way things shine. Ceus kept the straight line of thought. Phoebe kept its mirror. Themis wore the habit of fairness. Mnemosyne kept the shelf where memory would be placed. Rhea learned how to hold a house steady. Kronos kept the count of moments. They did not shout. They took their places the way a bench takes its corner under a window and promises to stay level. Sky was wide and pleased with himself and pressed down more than a ceiling should. In the deep chambers of earth other children stirred, strong and strange and too big for narrow rooms. Cyclopes with round eyes that loved the heat of forges. 100-handers with many hands who could work 3 chores at once and never lose count. They were set aside in the far place because the house was not ready for them yet. Earth felt that weight and did not enjoy it. A plan learned to breathe in her patience. She brought a piece of flint up from where pressure teaches stone to be honest. It was the kind of tool that ends one habit and starts another. She did not lift it herself. She showed it to her children, and then she waited to see which of them could hold it without anger. Kronos stepped forward not because he was the loudest, but because he understood measures. He took the tool and stood where Sky leaned too close, and he changed the way the house was built. The old weight lifted. The space between ceiling and floor learned to be generous. The sharp lesson traveled where water meets water, and the sea learned a bright foam along one coast. In that brightness, people later saw a goddess rise, a form that gave walls their murals and cities their troubles and sweetness. Far from the shore, drops that fell to the ground woke wild answers. Spirits of anger that never forget a debt. Giants who arrive when boundaries are walked on too hard. Trees with iron patience. The world did not fall apart. It adjusted. It is what the world does best when given a steady choice. With the ceiling eased and the rooms open, the rule of the Titans settled in like a long afternoon. Oceanus circled the land and taught rivers to arrive without fuss and to leave without being asked twice. Hyperion watched the day take its path and did not interrupt. Thea let metals remember how to gleam and stones how to take a polish. Themis taught the weight of a promise, how an oath sits on the tongue and then sits in the hand. Mnemosyne took quiet care of names and kept them from slipping off the edges of things. If a city later remembered where its first boundary stone had been set, it would be because she had left a thread tied to that thought. Rhea walked from hearth to hearth and set cups in even rows. She did not rule with noise. She ruled with inventory and a gentle way of asking whether the door was latched. Time in that age behaved like a cloth laid smooth on a table. There were hours for planting and hours for lifting full baskets. There were evenings for stories that did not try to finish. The stars learned where to stand and seemed content. In the mountain halls, the Cyclopes found fires that would listen and bellows that liked being asked to breathe. Rings took shape. Nails that would someday hold great doors learned their small tap. The 100-handers practiced lifting in silence, because silence makes a lift steadier. No one invited them to feasts. That would come later. Practice was enough. The house liked the sound of work done right far from its dining room. Kronos kept the count with care. He liked the feeling of a schedule that arrives on time. He walked the borders and found that he enjoyed them quiet. A man who likes quiet borders begins to listen for footsteps that might not be friendly. He begins to fear the voice that says tomorrow will be different. Earth remembered the tool that had changed the ceiling and knew that living things grow and make new rooms whether anyone gives permission or not. When Rhea carried children, Kronos turned inward and sharpened his worry. The story says he swallowed what was born to keep the count from changing. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon slipped into the dark and waited there. It is a hard sentence to hear. The old tellers speak it without music, the way a clerk writes a loss and leaves a space for the seal. Rhea's patience kept a different book. She wrapped her children. She mourned her children. She laid out bread, even on days that did not deserve it. When another child was coming, she spoke softly to earth and to the old quiet under mountains. Help does not always come as thunder. Sometimes it comes as a map, or as a room whose door has been oiled, or as hands that agree to beat a rhythm over louder noise. They made a place far away where a cry would not be noticed. They planned what would be set in a blanket if someone demanded to hold the baby and count its fingers. None of this was a speech. It was a row of small actions done without hurry. In the halls of the Titans, the work continued. Themis still set oaths in their bowls. Mnemosyne still tied names to corners so they would not drift. Oceanus turned and never grew angry with the land he circled. The sun kept its level promise. The moon learned to be on time most nights and laid on a few that needed it. Fires in the forges went down to embers when no one watched them, then woke with a breath on the coals and a steady hand. If you stepped into that world and did not ask for gossip, you would have liked its order. It would have felt like a long hallway with swept stones and no one hurrying you along it. Yet even in a long afternoon, there is a moment when the light changes color. Kronos began to hear that change in ordinary sounds. A hinge that had always answered with a soft vowel chose a harder one. A servant who had never dropped a cup set one down a little too firmly. The sea, which sings the same song every day, invented a new note as it curved around a headland. These are the ways a house tells its owner that a new room is almost ready and that the owner will not choose whether to use it. Rhea folded a cloth in 4 precise corners and set it where a hand that feared the future would find it. Earth moved 1 stone the width of a thumb. The old stories opened their next door here. By the end of the Titan hour, the table was still set and the lamp still burned in its careful dish, but a different footstep could be heard in the courtyard. It was small, and it did not hurry, and it belonged to someone who would learn to hold thunder without making a mess of it. Rhea looked toward a path that led to a far island. Kronos counted and found that the count refused to stay where he put it. The world did not tense. It breathed. The next part of the story was already on its way, not as a storm but as a child, and as the kind of allies that children seem to bring with them when the house decides to change. Rhea walked away from the bright halls and into country that did not carry news. She carried a small weight that changed how she held her shoulders. Earth felt her steps and made the path kind. A cave in Crete waited with its mouth turned quietly to the slope, ivy cooling the stone, a thin ribbon of water writing the same simple word again and again. Nymphs who knew how to keep a secret took the bundle and did not make speeches. A goat named Amalthea stood as if she had been standing there since before there were names, and gave milk without asking what for. Bees learned the shape of the cave and brought a little sweetness to the threshold, not as a festival, only as a habit that made the hours easier. The baby ate. The cave breathed. Rhea set a cloth down where a hand could find it later and walked back the way she came with empty arms and a plan folded small under her ribs. The exchange with Kronos happened the way careful exchanges do. There was a blanket. There was a shape inside it that weighed like a child if you did not let your hands think too long. There was a stone wrapped well and tucked deep, and there were words spoken in the calm voice of someone who has folded many linens and knows the worth of a steady tone. Kronos took what he expected to take. Swallowing had become a habit, and habits can be strong when they pretend to be safety. The house stayed quiet. The count in his head did not change, or so he believed. Down in the far place where he kept what he feared, the new weight did not complain. It sat like a promise that would prefer to be kept. In the cave, the child lay in a bed of leaves whose edges had been taught not to rustle. The Kurites kept watch outside with a rhythm that sounded like weather more than like men. They tapped shields to the measure of a lullaby and learned to stop before Echo remembered them. When the baby cried, the stone walls were already speaking in a way that folded the sound and set it down gently in a corner where no one went. The goat stood, chewed, and watched the door as if that were her whole job. Nymphs bent over the child with the economy of hands that know what each movement buys. They washed a face. They turned a blanket. They set a small charm of woven grass where a hand would find it without looking. The cave learned the smell of milk and warm linen and decided it liked both. Years became a stack of quiet chores. A boy learned the shape of a sloping path and how to place a foot on damp stone so it would not teach the ankle bad lessons. He learned to drink from a spring without waking the pool. He learned to listen for goats and for wind and to tell them apart with his eyes closed. He learned the names of trees in the order their shade arrived along the ledge. When storms came, he counted to the end of the thunder and found that the counting calmed the room around him as well. When clear days came, he walked the lip of the mountain and looked down into a sea that gave back the same look every time. Nymphs taught him to tie a knot that would open kindly. The goat taught him patience without saying a word. A day arrived when hillside habits were not enough. The child had become a youth with a hand that knew its own strength and a gaze that did not hurry. Rhea came in by a back way the cave had kept for her, and the two spoke without lifting their voices. Help would be needed. Help prefers to be named. The Cyclopes who had been set aside for being too much of something would like a chance to be useful. The 100-handers, who could lift 3 tasks in the time other men lifted 1, would do better in air than in rooms. There was also a small matter of a draft that could make a mouth remember what it had chosen to forget. The name for that draft was métis, which is another word for good thinking done quietly. The plan did not require heroics. It required trays wiped clean, a cup placed where a hand would naturally reach, and a door that would not complain when it opened. The first errand was mercy and inventory. In the deep place where old worries had been stored, locks learned to open and stayed open. The Cyclopes came up into air that had room for their chests. They squinted like men who have been reading too close to a lamp and now prefer the window. Their hands went at once to work, because work is how some beings say thank you. They gave the youth 3 gifts shaped like answers. In his right hand, a clear force that could persuade clouds to speak and then fall quiet again. In his other hand, the feeling that a thrown spear gives when it knows it belongs to the sea. And for his brother who would one day walk in darkness without being seen, a cap that taught eyes to forget. These were not toys. They were agreements with parts of the world that had been waiting to be asked in the right way. The second errand was a kitchen chore dressed as destiny. Métis, who understood mixtures, brewed a cup for Kronos that tasted like something remembered from a better year. It was not harsh. It was persuasive. The cup was set where a hand that always reached in the same place would find it. Kronos drank the way a man drinks at the end of a day he believes he has controlled. The cup did its work. The locked door inside him opened, and what had been taken in fear returned in the order it had gone. Hestia first, still calm. Then Demeter, steady as soil. Then Hera, with her careful ways of weighing a room. Then Hades, who knew how to stand where others prefer not to look. Then Poseidon, with the sound of a long breath already in him. They did not rush out waving flags. They stepped into light and took stock like people who know that mourning is longer than shouting. A war came, because change has to move through a house before it can settle in it. The old tellers call it 10 years and say it shook mountains. If you listen for sleep, you can hear it as a long set of shifts done in the right order. First, allies are brought to the right doors. Then food is counted. Then watchfires are set at distances that make signal rather than panic. Then the ground is studied until it chooses to be a friend. The Titans stood tall in their places, and there is a respect due to that. They had kept the hours even. They had taught the stars to be punctual. But time prefers to hand its ledger to new clerks now and then. On the last evenings, the 100-handers threw stones the size of rooms with the patience of men who have built walls for years. The Cyclopes kept the air obedient. The younger ones learned how to move without trying to be loud about it. The change of rule was not an explosion so much as a hinge finally learning to swing clean. The older order was set aside where old orders go when they have finished, in a distance that does not insult them and does not invite them back to the desk. The younger order walked up the steps without running. They set cups in the places they meant to keep them. They looked at each other and agreed to draw lots because luck, too, is a part of order if it is invited in the open and not smuggled under the table. A sky for one, a sea for another, a steady below for a third. But that part belongs to the next chapter. For now it is enough to notice that the cave in Crete had done its job, that the goat had done hers, that the bees had been correct to invest in sweetness, and that a plan carried by quiet hands had changed a house without burning it down. When the dust of practice settled, the youth who had been fed in hiding stood where ceiling and floor agree to let air pass. He did not look back to count victories. He looked forward to count tasks. Fires needed proper homes. Odes needed bowls. Roads needed markers. Guests needed doors that did not stick. He lifted his hand, and the weather listened, not like a servant, more like a friend who agrees to help when asked politely. He set his seat on a high place that was windy and beautiful, but that would still need sweeping every day, because that is what high places are. Below, the sea inhaled and exhaled on schedule. Below that, the deep place stayed deep and kept its promises. If you listen from your pillow, you can take this as the measure for your own turning. A door that once stuck now opens with a push that does not strain the shoulder. A cup that once tasted wrong now refreshes and returns what should not have been lost. Allies who had been put away are invited back and shown where their tools can hang. The old fear is not mocked. It is retired. Breath comes in. Breath goes out a little longer. A new order sits down at the table and looks around at the room with the expression of someone who intends to keep it tidy. That is enough for tonight. In the morning we will visit the high house and see how the chairs are set and how the rules are written so they will make sense when the weather changes. For now, you can rest where the cave was, with stone that holds the cool of evening and a spring that keeps its small sound whether anyone listens or not. The new rulers did not begin with thunder. They began with seating. On a high ridge where rock holds the day's warmth even after the sun forgets it, they set down stools and a broad table and decided how a house should run. Lots were drawn in open air so that luck would be a witness no one could scold. The sky, with its weather and its long roads for birds, came to Zeus. The sea, with its breathing and its harbors, came to Poseidon. The steady below, where roots do not wander and oaths do not dissolve, came to Hades. No one shouted. They nodded the way workers nod when the grain pile has been weighed and the numbers are written true. Work began with the small rules that keep big rules from tripping. Themis stood up and spoke quietly about fairness, which is only the habit of putting things back where they belong. Cups in their places. Doors that open for guests and shut against harm. Promises said aloud, heard, and then held in the hand. The Moirai, who were time practicing its stitch, took their seats by the threshold. One measured, one spun, one chose when to cut, and the scissors did not tremble. Near them the Ori learned the weather's schedule. Spring with its green grammar, summer with its long sentence, autumn with its storage, winter with its careful pause. The mountain took a deep breath and held it without strain. Zeus walked the edge of cloud and decided where thunder would be allowed to speak and where it must only think. He learned to lift a hand and ask a storm to arrive on the hour rather than on the rumor. He learned to turn a lightning thought into a line that did not burn the field that had not misbehaved. Beside him stood Iris, who carries color the way a messenger carries script. Her arc joined sea to sky, city to hill, camp to home, a polite bridge painted on air. Hermes learned the roads below and above. He tied messages to wing and sandal, to staff and rumor, and he trained them to reach their proper ears at a reasonable pace. Order is not a wall. It is a map that agrees with the ground. Poseidon went down to teach the sea its manners, which is a long way of saying he kept it from forgetting its own borders. He laid his trident on harbors like a ruler on parchment. He asked for waves that greet without slapping and currents that guide without trickery. He set a ring of quiet water around small boats learning their first routes. When anger needed an outlet, he took it offshore where it could exhaust itself in white lace and not bruise the wharves. Far below, Hades cleared halls for the steady work of endings. He did not scowl. He arranged. He made paths that could be walked without fear and rooms where memory could sit down and keep its voice. Oaths that needed to be heavier than stone were sworn by the Styx. When a god spoke that name, the words settled like a seal on a document and would not lift. Craft and thought found their shop on the mountain. Hephaestus set his bellows, and the good air of Olympus learned how to carry a forge without choking. Metal softened and took form under a hammer that was patient more than strong. Hinges that would hold gates for 100 years learned to be quiet on their pins. Athena spread her cloth and drew plans not only for city walls, but for the small tools that make a city kinder. Looms that do not tangle, locks that do not trap their owners, lamps that do not waste oil when no one is looking. Wisdom in her hands did not stand on tiptoe. It sat on a stool and measured twice before cutting once. Light gave the house its calendar. Apollo tuned the day until it stopped coughing and cleared its throat. His son learned to arrive with the same courtesy as a guest who knocks, waits, and then enters. The hours stepped into their sandals and kept to their lanes. When night returned, Artemis took the cool side of the sky and made it walkable. She taught shadows to be honest and paths to hold still underfoot. She kept watch for creatures that need dusk to live their small lives, and she convinced the wild to lower its voice in the neighborhoods where sleep must win. Between them, morning and evening learned to bow as they passed each other on the stairs. A hearth was needed so the world would not feel like a barracks. Hestia climbed the steps without asking for notice and lit the steady center. Her fire was not a show. It was a promise. Flame sat down and learned to listen. Bread arrived at the right times. Doorways decided to be kind to feet and to weather. In houses below, people imitated this room. They kept a small flame and fed it as one feeds a cat that has learned the household's habits. A home is a tiny Olympus, and a city is many such rooms connected by streets that behave. Hospitality became law so that strangers would not arrive like storms. Zeus Xenios kept the ledger for it and balanced it without scolding. A host offers water, a seat, a bite of something honest. A guest offers a name, even if it is only a traveling name that keeps the journey safe. A gift is remembered. A wrong is corrected quietly if it can be. If not, Nemesis keeps a calm quill and writes a line that will be read when the hour is ready. Temples were raised not as trumpets, but as shelters for attention. Pillars held up a small sky where a god could be thanked without hurry. Altars learned the modest smoke of barley and the clean cut of a shared animal offered not for hunger alone, but for the habit of gratitude that keeps a city from curdling. Disputes arrived and were taught to speak softly. When two fields argued, Hermes walked the boundary with a rod and a string and reminded stones where they had stood the year before. When two tongues argued, Themis poured water into a bowl and invited each to see himself in it before speaking again. When heat would not lower, Athena asked for proofs and offered tools. When pride would not bend, Apollo measured breath with a song that was longer than temper. In this way, Olympus acted like a court that does not wear wigs, a place where answers are found by setting weights on the right side of the scale until the beam size into level. Even desire learned its seat and its hour. Aphrodite, risen bright from the shore's old foam, brought sweetness that could cause trouble if untethered. Pytho, her gentle companion, taught persuasion to walk rather than to rush. Ares rattled his spear now and then to remind cities that armor exists, but he was made to wait in the vestibule until grown minds had finished their talk. Dionysus, when he came, taught vines to climb trellises rather than houses, and he taught celebration to end with water and sleep instead of breaking the furniture. Order is not a denial of joy. It is the fence that keeps joy from wandering into the neighbor's yard and being mistaken for theft. When all these things were settled enough to last a season, the mountain learned to be quiet again. Clouds rested on its shoulders like shawls. Eagles traced slow loops that meant nothing and everything. The gods were not statues. They were habits made visible, fairness that holds, craft that works, light that keeps time, night that keeps rest, sea that keeps harbor, earth that keeps promise, underworld that keeps words weighty. If you listened, you could hear the house breathing. Not a palace that shouts, but a workshop that tidies itself before locking up. If you are lying there with your eyes half closed, take this as a pattern for your own room. A place for the cup, a place for the key, a window taught to open without complaint, a lamp trimmed to the right oval. Breath in as the sun reaches the mark on the threshold. Breath out as the hearth gives its small sound and the door remembers how to be kind. The mountain keeps watch. The sea keeps time. The road keeps its width. The house of the world has learned its manners for tonight, and that is enough. Before cities learned marble and laws, they learned bread. The teacher was Demeter. She did not arrive with trumpets. She arrived with a basket and a way of looking at soil that made even poor ground feel it might do better. Where she walked, furrows remembered to be straight. Where her hand passed, barley heads kept their count. She spoke to farmers the way a lamp speaks to a room. Without hurry, without pride, just enough light for the next good step. In that steadiness a daughter grew beside her, Persephone, a bright presence who moved through meadows as if paths appeared to meet her. Flowers leaned toward her, not because she commanded, but because looking at her was as easy as looking at clean water. On a morning with weather so clear it felt polished, Persephone bent toward a bloom that had learned a sweet color overnight. The ground answered with a soft seam that widened into a door. Nothing screamed. Earth made room, as doors make room. From that doorway came the one who keeps the steady below. Hades did not rush. He does not know how to rush. He lifted his eyes, saw the child of the harvest, and understood that the large house under the world had been too quiet for too long. He spoke a word that did not bruise the air, reached with hands that had never dropped what they were given, and set Persephone beside him in a chariot that waited as still as a thought. The seam closed behind them. On the hillside, grass laid itself back down, and only a few petals remembered the direction in which they had leaned. Absence is a teacher. Demeter called her child by the names that had always brought an answer and heard only the same meadow replying with bees. She went inland with a torch in each hand and did not put them down even in daylight. She asked hills what they had seen and took their silence for honesty. At crossroads, she paused and counted paths, and then chose the one that had the smallest pride in it. Hecate, who knows where doors have been, joined her with a lamp that never wastes oil. Helios, who misses very little, told what his wide gaze had witnessed. The seam, the gentle taking, the chariot, the long, careful road to the deep hall. He did not offer a judgment. He kept to the telling, which is all a witness owes. Travel wears shoes, and it wears hearts. Demeter came at last to a low town that had learned to lift its roofs against weather without pretending to be important. Eleusis opened a doorway, and a woman named Metanera offered a chair without fuss and a cup that knew barley and water and a touch of mint. The goddess sat as a stranger in a gray cloak and watched a hearth that understood its job. The child of the house, Demosthenes, woke from sleep with the look all infants have, the expression of someone new to agreements who still believes in them completely. Demeter took him in her arms and held him the way a season holds a field. She fed him wisely, taught him to rest, and in the night, when no eyes were meant to be busy, she passed him through a low fire as one might pass cloth through light to remove the burrs of time. It was an old kindness, practiced slowly, a way to give a mortal a quieter kind of living. Once, the mother woke, saw fire where she expected only sleep, and cried out with alarm. The sound broke the ritual as a sudden wind breaks a mirror surface on water. Demeter did not scold. She stood up in her full height and set the gray cloak aside and let the room know whose guest it had been. Gentle awe filled the corners. She asked the family to build a clean place on the hill, a small temple with a floor that would learn the sound of feet making promises. There she sat with her torches laid on the stones, and there she kept a silence the fields could hear. They obeyed the mood of their teacher. Shoots that had been ready to show themselves held back. Heads that had been heavy with grain let their weight lighten. The earth did not become angry. It became thoughtful in a way that made baskets light. People felt the lesson and did not know how to solve it. Zeus, who keeps the ledger for weather and the long welfare of households, looked out from the high place and saw a balance that had to be corrected. Without bread, oats lose weight. He sent Hermes on the good road that reaches every room without insult. Hermes went down with his staff held like sense carried into a difficult conversation. He came to the halls where Hades rules without noise. The air there does not chill, it steadies. Shades keep their places. The seats, though dark, are respectful. Persephone sat beside the king, no longer a child of fields only, but not yet a queen who has finished learning the names of every corridor. Words were exchanged in the low manner that grown minds prefer. A mother needed her child. A house below had found the person for whom its rooms had waited. How to give each their share without tearing the cloth. In the telling we receive, a small fruit sits near the moment when decisions are made. A pomegranate contained brightness, seeds like tidy rubies, sweetness bound to law. Persephone took a taste, 6 crimson grains, some say, others fewer, others more, and by that small act learned the rule of that house. What you partake of, you belong to in some measure. No chain, only a thread tied gently to her wrist. Rhea, who keeps peace by remembering every cupboard and every birth, came as mediator. She proposed the sort of fairness that stands up well through time. Part of the year with the mother in light and markets and the merry noise of threshing. Part of the year with the husband in halls where voices are softer and gratitude is a chair set for each arrival. The share would be counted in months. While Persephone walks the upper roads, Demeter smiles into soil and tells seed the old promises. When Persephone returns below, Demeter folds her bright cloak and lets fields rest under a careful gray. With that agreement, the world learned to read its own breath. Spring is the in-breath, green entering with a shy sound. Summer is the held note, long and sure. Autumn is the satisfied exhale, granaries closing their mouths with a good weight behind the door. Winter is the pause that makes music possible. Mills learn the rhythm. Markets learn it. Mothers and travelers and bees learn it. Demeter's temple at Eleusis learned it so well that the floor remembers it even now. There, by torchlight, people were taught a quiet ritual that behaved like a promise between the living and the gentle dead. Nothing frightening. A bowl, a stalk of grain, a path walked in order, a word not shouted. The lesson was simple. What goes down can return. What is hidden can be met without panic. What rests is not always lost. The story is sometimes told as if it were about theft and punishment. In the pace we are keeping tonight, you can feel it as a careful sharing of time. Hades is not a villain here. He is a keeper of contracts and rooms that deserve respect. Demeter is not unreasonable. She is the margin of safety on which all kitchens depend. Persephone is not passive. She is the person who carries two worlds in her pockets and teaches them to speak without talking over each other. Hermes is the road that stays honest even in the dark. Rhea is the elder who does not raise her voice because she never needs to. Zeus is the ceiling that remembers not to lean. Each does a part of the work that lets bread be bread and grief be livable and return be real. In fields that remember this chapter, the first digging is done with a kind of ceremony that would look like simple thrift to anyone hurrying past. A fist of earth is crumbled and allowed to fall back through fingers to show seed the kindness it can expect. A cup of water is poured not as magic, but as habit, so that the hand remembers generosity before the sky gives rain. A corner of the plot is left for what no one planted on purpose, because some gifts arrive without names and a household should be ready to be polite to them. At harvest, a handful of grain is kept apart and set high where mice will not learn its address. These are the beginnings of next year, already honored and comfortable in their bowl. When winter walks the lanes, Demeter's torches are remembered as candles set low in windows. People come in earlier. Stories last longer. Bread smells fuller. The ground under snow keeps its own company and does not resent the coverlet. Down below, Persephone sets her seat with a new assurance and listens to old names spoken with a music only that house knows. She carries the memory of time on hillsides, and when she returns to light, she carries the memory of cool rooms full of finished sentences. In her, the seasons speak to each other without shouting. Above, in barns and pantries, the little jars learn to line up in steady ranks. Below, in corridors that do not end, chairs are kept dusted for whoever might need them later. It is all one economy. If you are listening on a night that has been long in the wrong way, borrow this measure. And gently, as seed slides into a furrow and finds it was expected, out slowly, as an autumn door closes with the soft weight of enough. You are allowed a season for everything you carry: work, rest, decision, waiting. No part has to win. They share the year and make it livable. When your thoughts feel like a field that forgot which weather it wanted, set a small ritual the way Eleusis set a lamp. One cup, one breath, one repeated word that does not have to persuade anyone. It only has to be true. Persephone will climb. Persephone will descend. Demeter will teach the furrows their patience again. Between those certainties, there is always room for sleep. Cities did not begin as walls. They began as places where a lamp could be trusted to behave. Athena taught that lesson without a trumpet. She set a stool by a table and unrolled cloth with the calm of someone who knows that good plans speak quietly. She drew a line where a street should run so water would not argue with it, and she marked a square where a market could breathe even on crowded days. She showed masons how to persuade stone to accept a plumb line, and she showed potters how a will keeps its word if the hands keep theirs. When she spoke of defense, she did not start with spears. She started with hinges that would not stick and gates that would close straight, because a city that moves well is a city that survives longer than a shout. Inside the rooms that filled those streets, she sat near looms and made the cross of warp and weft into an alphabet. Threads learned patience under her fingers. The shuttle carried its small boat of yarn back and forth until cloth grew as steady as a thought that has been tested. Patterns walked the surface like quiet stories, a meander that remembered rivers, olive leaves that remembered their trees, simple diamonds that remembered nets. She did not despise simple garments. A good tunic that hangs true is a kind of law you can wear. She corrected uneven edges with a touch and praised the even ones with a nod. The women who watched her did not leave feeling small. They left with tools that refused to betray them at the end of a long day. Across the ridge, Hephaestus kept a different classroom. Fire breathed through bellows that did not gasp because he had taught them how to breathe. Iron softened without sulking, took the hammer without complaint, and cooled without splitting in a mood. Tongs learned to hold what was hot, as if it were a promise rather than a danger. Nails came out even. Rivets sat where they belonged and did not wander. When he made hinges, they swung without announcing themselves. When he made locks, they opened for the right key and for no other, which is a kind of justice. He liked to wipe a tool before he set it down, not because it looked fine that way, but because the next hand to lift it should meet it clean. Between loom and forge, the day kept its calendar with Apollo. He tuned the light until mornings arrived with the calm certainty of a guest who knows the house. Shadows learned the length they should keep at each hour. The air lost its cough and spoke clearly. When he lifted a lyre, it was not to collect applause. It was to show breath how to pace itself. Farmers matched their steps to that measure without thinking about it. Clerks found that numbers behaved when the sun did. In the temples where his name lived, questions were not answered with riddles to make men dizzy. They were answered with lines straight enough to walk between. When light folded its wings, Artemis took the edges of the world into her care. She did not darken the woods to frighten anyone. She taught them to be honest at night. Paths held still underfoot. Animals that preferred dusk came and went with the dignity of neighbors. A lamp in a window learned to be visible from a fair distance, not because it was loud, but because the quiet around it was well kept. She stood at the borders where wild and garden share a fence and corrected the fence when it forgot which side it was supposed to serve. Hunters who kept her manners learned to move as if they owned less than the ground under each step. Those who did not learn to sit and think. Desire asked for a seat as cities grew. Aphrodite took it, not as a conqueror, but as a teacher of sweetness that can make houses livable if it is taught its hour. She walked through markets and turned quarrels into purchases with a glance. She stood beside brides and reminded them that patience says I love you more often than silk does. Her companion Pytho, persuasion, smoothed the air between two people until words could cross without catching. When love tried to run like a river in flood, Ares rattled his spear from the far end of the street, eager to turn feeling into noise. But the door to the council chamber stayed shut to him until arguments had worked themselves into sense. On feast days he was invited to sit outside and admire the banners. He learned to be pleased with that. Hermes threaded all of this together with roads. He was not only speed, he was placement. Milestones stood where he set them and pointed honestly. Markers at forks kept travelers from inventing their own paths. In town, he reinvented the boundary stone as a neighborly object, set at the right height for a hand to rest on during a talk. He curated doorways. He taught lintels to be exactly as high as they looked and thresholds to be even with the floor, because tripping is a poor welcome. He enjoyed letters, not for their cleverness alone, but for their ability to let a promise travel when its maker was busy elsewhere. Contracts that passed through his fingers returned to their owners in the same order as they left. He kept a list of inns that washed their cups properly. At the center of every house Hestia kept watch without watching. Her fire sat and listened. It did not leap except when invited. Bread rose because her warmth did not waver. The smell of soup left the window at a measured pace, neither greedy nor stingy. She taught cats to find the warm brick and children to approach with respect. When strangers arrived, Hestia laid a cushion over the hard part of a bench so no one would begin their stay by feeling unwelcome. When storms paced outside, she taught the room how to pretend it could not hear the thunder. In cities, her tiny flames multiplied behind doorways until the whole town felt like one large hearth with many rooms. Under such hands, the small objects of life became allies. A cup that pours without dribbling saves as much patience as a treaty. A key that turns without sticking spares more tempers than a speech. A cart whose axle is greased at the right hour keeps markets from fraying at the edges. A lamp trimmed to the right oval trains the eye to read until the mind decides it has had enough for one night. A knife honed for the kitchen rather than the alley keeps arguments out of the street. A broom lean bristles up learns to last longer. A door barred at bedtime remembers how to welcome morning. In this way, craft, loom and forge and lyre and road and lamp became the quiet constitution of ordinary days. Temples rose among these habits, not to impress the sky, but to educate the ground. Pillars taught roofs how to be noble without being heavy. Colonnades taught crowds how to be orderly without signs. Altars taught hands how to measure enough. In front of these buildings, water basins held the calm of first light and invited faces to match it. Priests, when they did their work well, were custodians of timing rather than thunder. If a procession set out, it did so because the street was ready and the people had done their chores. If a festival began, it knew where it would end and whom it would leave to sweep. The gods did not need flattery. They needed the city to function so quietly that gratitude remained the loudest feeling men had time for. Even when ships left the harbor, this order traveled with them. Ropes were coiled the same way they were coiled at home. The cook fire was ringed with stones that remembered kitchens. The captain kept Apollo's schedule and Artemis's care for the shadowed edge. Hermes's rules governed the ledger. Hestia's concern followed the pot. Athena's plans kept the oars from arguing. Hephaestus's iron advised the anchor on when to speak and when to wait. Aphrodite kept peace between men far from their loves, and Ares was told to save his voice for an hour that required it. Out on the water, a city that moved learned to carry its manners like ballast. If you are lying in your own room now, you can borrow this chapter's furniture. Picture a key that turns smoothly and a cup that does not spill. Imagine a hinge that does not squeak when you lean your weight against the door to close it. See a lamp that agrees to be small and faithful. Set your street in order, at least the street in your head. Ask Hermes to set a marker at the fork where worry goes one way and sleep goes the other. Ask Athena to lay a straight edge along your thoughts until the knots look embarrassed and let themselves out. Ask Hephaestus to cool what has been too hot today. Ask Hestia to keep the center steady. Ask Apollo for a morning you can trust and Artemis for a night that respects the path to your bed. The city of the world will keep working while you rest. Loaves will rise in unseen kitchens. Roads will lie still and wait for feet. The forge will remember where the hammer left off. The loom will hold its place without tangling. The sea will breathe against the stones like a huge animal that has learned its manners. You do not have to stand guard over any of it. You can let the tools lean where they lean, the fire sit where it sits, and the door be a door. The gods have turned the day down to its smallest true shape. It is ready to last till morning. When the world had learned its rooms and the gods had settled their seats, a quieter rhythm began to show itself in human lives. It was a rhythm of errands set in a row, of tokens placed in careful hands, of roads that asked for patience more than strength. We call those who walk these errands heroes, but in this telling they are mostly good students of instructions. They watch. They accept small tools. They keep lists. They return without insisting on trumpets. If you listen for sleep, you can hear how similar their stories are, how each begins at a doorway with a reminder, proceeds by measured steps, and ends with someone folding a cloak and putting a key back where it belongs. Perseus learns the pattern first. A boy in a coastal house, a mother who keeps a steady lamp, a king who prefers riddles to fairness. The task is stated as if it were impossible, yet the boy is not sent out empty. At a crossroads, two kindly teachers meet him with tools, not speeches. A polished shield that keeps light honest. A short blade balanced to be an extension of the hand and not a boast. Sandals that ask the air to behave like a road when needed. A bag that knows how to hold something without telling the world what it holds. Directions follow, not in blazes of lightning, but in tidy steps. Find the ones who live by a stream that remembers other people's sleep. Ask for a path to other keepers. Follow the road that has fewer stones raised by pride. He learns to ask questions in the tone carpenters use when they want the wood to meet the measure. He learns to move sideways when straight on would stir the water. When the task is done, he walks home with feet that still know how to go at a household pace. And the gift he carries is used for mending a wrong before it is stored away, where children cannot harm themselves on it. Bellerophon learns the same grammar with different nouns. There is a spring at dawn where a winged horse comes to drink because the water has the taste it prefers. The boy is given a bridle not heavy with decoration, only honest leather and a bit that lies gentle on the tongue. He is told to arrive before the world remembers to be loud, to keep his breath even, to hold out the bridle as one offers bread to a shy animal. The horse accepts, as sensible creatures do when kindness and timing are correct. The next part of the lesson is not a contest. It is a long ride that teaches how reins are a conversation, not a command. Later, a letter tries to make trouble with errands inside it, but the pattern protects him. Each test becomes a list of tasks that ask for steadiness. Cross a hill the wind likes. Circle a fire without letting panic choose the path. Carry a message to a gate and wait until the gate chooses to open. His rewards are not thunder. They are the kind of confidence that makes a man good company for long journeys. Theseus comes with tokens set under a stone by hands that understood how memory works. A pair of sandals that will teach the road not to cheat the step. A short sword that prefers correctness to drama. A mother who points him toward the long route where good manners are needed, and then toward a city that keeps its own complicated calendar. On the path, he meets men who have forgotten the rules of doorways. He reminds each of them what a boundary is for and continues without collecting enemies. In the city, he learns that problems in houses are usually solved by thread rather than by noise. A young woman who has already arranged too many rooms offers him a spool and a way of thinking. Tie the beginning to something that refuses to move. Walk slowly while you work. Keep a loose loop in your left hand. Come back by the same song you used to go in. He does, and when he emerges, he does not rename the world after himself. He rolls the thread, pays attention to a rising wind on the sea, and learns, a little too late, which is how people learn, that signals must be changed when promises are kept. If you lay these stories on a table, they align like boards cut from the same tree. There is always an errand stated too simply. There is always a gift that is also a reminder. There is always a path that prefers care to courage. There is always a return that measures itself by the needs of the house rather than the appetites of the crowd. The gifts are plain. A mirror that turns danger into a rule about looking. Sandals that speak quietly to distance. A bridle that teaches partnership. A thread that declines to be clever and chooses to be correct. Even the places repeat their kindness. Dawn springs, quiet caves, doorways that hold their shape under the hand. Workshops where metal listens and cloth keeps its edges. Hospitable rules walk beside the heroes like older siblings. A traveler enters and is given water first, then a seat, then a question with room for a truthful answer. A bargain is placed on the table where everyone can touch it. A promise is written, if not with ink, then with inventory. A cup set aside, a cloak folded for a return, a place left empty on a bench until the person who should fill it arrives. When the rules are broken, the correction is measured. A wrongdoer is faced with his own trick and asked to look at it until it becomes ordinary and embarrassing. A king who played with riddles learns to live with plain speech. The world does not overturn itself. It tidies. There is a lesson in how noise is managed. Encounters that other versions of the tale dress in teeth and shouts are here reduced to chores that require clean hands. A glare becomes a light control problem solved by reflection and angle. A flame becomes a boundary problem solved by path and distance. A maze becomes a filing problem solved by making a copy of the route while you walk it. In each case, the hero does not become large. The problem becomes small. The air, having been taught to be a road for a little while, returns to being air. The horse, having lent its wings to a careful rider, keeps them and continues to visit the spring because the spring has not forgotten how to be itself. Mothers and mentors are present in every doorway. A woman lays out bread with the same care she lays out advice and expects both to be used before they stale. A craft god wipes a tool and hands it over handle first. A wise sister adjusts the fit of a helmet and the tightness of a buckle and says the sentence that keeps a young person from wasting 3 hours on a mistake. Go now, and do not try to make the road finish faster than it wants to. Even when a favor is immense, its form is modest. The sandals are light. The blade is short. The thread is ordinary. The bridle is soft. The help given is always of the kind that, after the story, can be hung on a peg and used to mend a fence or tie back a curtain. When fame arrives, it behaves. A hall is built, but its floor is swept. A cup is carved, but it pours without dripping. The singer who tells the deed keeps his lyre tuned to the breath of the listeners and lets the children sleep in the doorway without waking them for the loudest parts. Gifts are set on shelves and in chests where they will be useful rather than displayed to make neighbors restless. A city names a gate after someone and still oils the hinges. A road is widened and still respects the tree that has lived beside it longer than maps have been drawn. The world is not asked to change its weather to celebrate a single name. Weather keeps weather's schedule. Soon a larger student will arrive to copy this pattern many times. He will keep a list and move down it like a clerk who likes a clear desk at the end of the day. He will clean a river by understanding flow instead of fighting mud with hands. He will lift and fetch and persuade and return, and between each task he will sleep under a roof when he can, or under a sky that does not mind him when he cannot. But that counting belongs to the next chapter. Tonight the lesson is simply this. Most great tales in this world are made of small obediences, done in order, with tools that do not pretend to be magic after they have done their work. If you are listening with your eyes already half closed, borrow the hero's way of walking. In as the thread is tied to the doorpost. Out, a little longer, as the line unwinds with your steps. In as the bridle is offered with a steady hand. Out as the animal breathes and agrees. In as the mirror is lifted to turn glare into guidance. Out as the sandals learn the rhythm of the road. You do not need trumpets to leave one room and enter another. You need a token that reminds you what you meant to do and a path that forgives your feet for being human. The door is here. The lamp is small and kind. The next task is only a sentence long. Tomorrow will bring the rest. He arrives like a large apprentice with a tidy ledger. The name is Heracles, but for this hour think of him as a man who likes a desk cleared by evening. A king with a nervous temperament keeps the list. A road god keeps the milestones honest. The great house of the world provides tools already described in quieter chapters. Rope that holds, levers that do not slip, a patient back, and breath measured the way Apollo measures mornings. 12 lines wait to be crossed off. No trumpet is invited. A lamp is lit. The first task stands up and takes its turn. The Lion of Nemea is not a riddle, but a fabric problem. Its hide refuses needles. Heracles studies it the way a weaver studies a tangle, and chooses the one method that cloth respects when all others fail. Pressure applied where threads cross. He closes the room with his own arms and ends a habit of terror with one long, careful hold. When the hide is his, the world teaches him a trick a worker would appreciate. If a blade sulks, use the horn of the problem as the knife. He lifts a new coat over his shoulders, not as a boast, but as protection for weather still to come, and writes a small mark beside line 1. Next comes the wet lesson at Lerna. Heads that renew themselves ask for a change in rhythm. He does not swing until he is tired. He sets a pace that allows a friend to work alongside him. For every cut, a flame answers, and together steel and fire learn to agree. The marsh, which likes to keep secrets, finds its hiding places persuaded closed by ash and stone. The great body withdraws into the water's old grammar and stops troubling the edge where people draw their buckets. Heracles does not shout. He notes that patience plus a second pair of hands can outvote multiplication, and he writes a mark on line 2. The golden horn hind is a year-long errand in quiet shoes. Heracles does not chase. He follows, lightly, season to season, along skirts of snow and through summer dust, learning the animal's calendar without offending it. When he at last lays a hand on the soft place between neck and shoulder, he does it with the courtesy of someone borrowing a tool. Artemis arrives in that hush, and they speak without heat. The hind is shown, counted, and returned as if the page were only being turned for a moment. Line 3 receives its mark, and no hoof remembers fear. Winter makes good company for the boar of Erymanthus. Snow slows what anger likes to do. Heracles drives the great animal up where drifts teach even the strong to stand still. He does not harm it. He straps it the way a cart is strapped to keep goods from shifting, and he brings it down through trees that step politely aside. In the little town, a nervous king dives for a jar rather than greeting the delivery at the gate. No one laughs. Heracles records the successful transport of a difficult weight and wipes his rope before coiling it. Line 4 is marked. The Augean stables look like a punishment and turn out to be a civil engineering problem. He measures fall. He remembers that water loves to help if asked in the language of slope and clearance. With a few quiet cuts, he invites 2 rivers to walk through a building that has forgotten how to keep house. They enter as guests, do their sweeping, and leave by a door shaped for them. No shouting, no miracles, only timbers, wedges, levers, and a day spent respecting the nature of flow. He thanks the streams with plain stones set where they can rest, then closes the sluice. Line 5 receives its neat stroke. Birds at Stymphalus are another tone of nuisance, air full of metal feathers and bad manners. Athena lends a rattle made for waking, not for war. Heracles stands at the right distance and shakes a sound into the reeds that teaches wings to lift as one. When the sky refuses hiding, troubles are easier to net. Some fly away to a part of the map that prefers them. Some fall to earth and become a list of repairs to be made before planting season. The lake relearns its mirror. Fishermen relearn their routes. Line 6 is finished with a small, satisfied dot. On Crete, a bull has remembered its strength too often. Heracles meets it with rope and the vocabulary of calm. He does not anger the animal. He tires it with circles that grow smaller until breath chooses cooperation. A loop kisses a horn. A second loop respects the neck. The great head lowers as if learning a bow. He leads it like a cart, slowly, with one hand on the halter and one eye on the path. Delivered, it stands in its new field as if the day has been a long lecture it needed to hear. Line 7 is written and the rope hung to dry. The Mares of Diomedes have learned the wrong diet from a cruel tutor. Habits this deep require unlearning in a quiet place. Heracles moves them away from the noise that trained them and gives them distance, water, and time until hunger loses its temper and becomes a simple need again. Grooms with steady wrists take over. The bad lesson is removed along with the man who taught it. Gates close with relief. Hooves remember pasture. Grain resumes its old conversation with teeth. Heracles notes that some victories are simply the removal of a pressure that never should have been applied. Line 8 is crossed out with care. Far away, a girdle requested from a queen is solved best by talking to the owner. Heracles arrives where Hippolyta keeps order among riders who prefer clarity to drama. In some tellings, a rumor spoils the meeting. In others, the exchange is straightforward: a gift asked for, a gift given, a nod between people who understand command. In this restful telling, he keeps to courtesy, accepts the belt as a token of trust, and departs without testing anyone's patience. A bad story is avoided, a good rule is confirmed: ask first. Line 9 is marked as neatly as a signature. The cattle of Geryon live beyond long heat and longer distance. Heracles takes the road in measured days, stringing camps like beads. When a channel blocks his way, he stacks stones until the water admits a ford, and later ages call the piles pillars because names like to grow tall. A red dog is persuaded to sleep. A bright herdsman is given his due and set aside from harm. The cattle march in file as if a drum they trust were beating somewhere just ahead. Thorns are cut, fairies are coaxed, stars are consulted. Back home, the herd enters new pasture, and the ledger shows line 10 completed in patient ink. For the apples that belong to a western garden, he uses a colleague rather than a ladder. Atlas, who holds the sky because someone must, is asked to rest his shoulders while Heracles takes the weight for a time. He stands under the blue with his feet placed exactly right and discovers that strength likes accuracy. Atlas returns with fruit and a plan to keep walking, but Heracles plays a small, friendly trick of straps and phrasing and restores each task to the person it fitted best. The apples arrive on the table without bruises. Line 11 receives its mark, and the shoulders remember what they learned about stance. The last errand descends where endings live, in halls that do not need candles because the dark there is a kind that sees. Heracles asks permission rather than making noise. Hades keeps a house that respects rules. Requests made properly are not despised. Cerberus is a lesson in handling, a many-headed guardian who answers to steadiness. No iron, no blades, only grip and breath and the habit of not panicking when demands multiply. The great dog is led up, shown, counted, and led back down to resume his post with dignity unhurt. The keeper nods. The visitor bows. The door remembers how to close. Line 12 is crossed in the same hand as line 1. When the ledger is full of small marks, Heracles does not burn it. He puts it away like a tool he may never need again, but chooses to keep clean. The world is better swept in 12 particular corners. Roads lie a little safer. Rivers remember they can help. Birds keep to their proper sky. Bulls and horses accept halters that do not lie. A woman keeps her belt because trust was honored. A garden keeps its fruit because agreements were kept. A gate below remembers that even strength knows courtesy. If you are still awake, let your breathing copy the list. 12 in, 12 out, each a little calmer than the last. The day has been counted. The lamp can be turned low. The next chapter will start by the sea, where a wooden thought waits for night to become morning. On an afternoon set out like a tablecloth, a wedding was held for a sea nymph and a wise old soldier of the shore. Cups were filled, names were blessed, and only one guest did not receive an invitation: Strife, who likes to arrive unasked. She came anyway and set a single golden apple where talk was thickest, the fruit scratched with a sentence that makes trouble wherever it goes, to the fairest. 3 high presences looked down at the same curve of light and saw a mirror they did not wish to share. The mountain could not hold all those glances. A quiet shepherd was asked to judge. A young man kept more by his thoughts than by his sheep. Gifts were offered in the sweet voice that promises no cost. He reached for one that sounded like simple happiness, a beautiful wife to keep his fireside from feeling lonely. The apple changed hands. The wind held its breath for a moment and then remembered its job. In another country, a daughter of a king sat among women who knew the hour of wool and the hour of bread. Suitors had come like a small army pretending to be a festival. A clever man from a rocky island proposed a rule to keep their rivalry from turning the house into a field. Swear, he said, to honor the choice that is made, and, if harm ever falls on the marriage, to come when called and set the door straight again. They swore, perhaps to be finished with swearing, perhaps because the rules sounded neat, and sleep comes easier when rules are neat. The choice fell to the man who kept a lion on his shield. Her name was carried to his halls with garlands and respectful music. The rooms learned her steps. It should have been the end of a story and the start of a long housekeeping. The wind, however, had other places to visit. A guest arrived in the king's absence, a visitor whose manners were careful and whose eyes were not. He talked as if he admired the house, and the house believed him. Songs and wine make quick friends of strangers. Before the city fully woke to its miscalculation, a ship had been loaded with goods a home should keep, and with a woman a home does not willingly lose. Sails took the idea of the promise sworn by many men and stretched it tight in clean cloth. Smoke did not yet rise from any wall. Doors still opened to neighbors. But down the coast, messengers had begun their soft gallop, and the quiet road that leads to war had already been swept. At Olympus, where gulls know ship names, the long benches of many prows gathered until the bay looked like a carpenter's rack. Men's voices rolled in a steady hum that says the counting is almost done. The wind, which had been a reliable clerk to that harbor for as long as anyone remembered, sat with folded hands and would not bring its pen. Priests checked the sky and found the ink dry. In some tellings, a hard choice is made there that a father cannot explain and a daughter meets with a still face. In others, the gods themselves arrange a substitution and carry the girl away to live a different calendar. However sung, a wind is learned, the cloth fills, and the fleet moves out in lines so straight that the sea seems proud to hold them. Troy stood with its high stones looking neither ashamed nor vain, a city that loved markets and mornings and the sound of sandals on clean streets. Inside, a gentle old king kept his chair as if he were keeping a promise. A prince who was a soldier by habit rather than by boast walked the walls and named their parts with a hand on the stone, the way a man touches the shoulder of a friend. A second prince, handsome and absent-minded, had brought more than a guest to his father's table, and the house could not swallow it. On the beach across the water, the visiting tents rose in quiet rows, each with its own way of keeping order. A man of wide power counting ships and not smiles, a swift fighter whose patience was shorter than his stride, an island king stacking plans like kindling, two large champions who preferred their sentences brief, many others with smaller banners and the same need for shade at noon. What followed is told as 10 years of noise. Heard at the pace of sleep, it is long routine with bursts of decision. Watchfires are set at the measured distances that make a ring rather than a tangle. Raids are scheduled not to offend the moon. Boats pull up at coves and pull away again with timbers unbruised. Embassies walk from tent to gate at midnight, when cities listen best. Honeyed bowls are set between men who disagree skillfully. Speeches are given that try to keep grief from becoming policy. Sometimes a bargain almost holds. More often the old rule applies. Once a debt is written on air, it demands to be spoken every morning until someone changes the sentence. Inside the walls, life does not stop. Looms keep their gentle thunder like rain on a roof. Children learn the names of gates and which alleys make shade in summer. Women carry water in jars that have learned to ride a hip. Men who are not on the walls argue about olives and give in. Priam's family keeps a book of evenings and tries not to smudge it with what the beach is doing. On the other side of the plain, a singer walks among tents with a lyre that counts in a way that calms rough hands. He praises and he scolds, and sometimes he is asked to stop, and sometimes he is asked to start again from the part where the door almost opened and then did not. There are angers that make more noise than armies. Between the greatest fighter and the man who keeps the lists, a quarrel rises, and the sea learns new ripples near the ships. The swift one sits in his tent and looks at his hands as if they were tools he might never need again. Days pass that do not know what to do with themselves. A friend borrows the heavy armor to lend courage to an afternoon that will not be kept in order any other way. The friend does what he can with the borrowed shine and then is brought back without it. The city hears mourning that does not ask whose side you are on. Both camps keep still for a time and find that stillness can be a teacher. When the swift one returns to work, he moves like weather that has remembered its appointment, the kind that clears a field and then leaves because it has finished. A funeral fire is taught to rise as high as a life deserves and then to lie down like a tired soldier. Years write themselves in layers of habit and correction. Gates are tested by rams, then cleaned and oiled. Ditches fill, are emptied, and fill again. The river learns detours. Names enter the ledger and are underlined, then are not spoken for a while. When they return with a softer pencil. Priam walks out between guards and takes a young hand in his old one and reclaims the body that wore the city's patience like a cloak. Men who have been enemies for a season look at a father kneeling and forget what their knees are for. A day is carved out for breathing. After that day, the ledger opens again, because ledgers always do. The end does not come with a roar. It comes with carpentry. The visitor from the rocky island draws a horse on the ground with his staff and lists the materials without smiling. A forest stands a little thinner by evening. Planks learn to curve in a way that pleases boat builders and deceives watchmen. A belly is made that prefers silence. Men who have learned to breathe like sleeping sailors climb inside and lie as if a long night had asked them to obey. The beach pretends to be tired of the argument. Sails fall, ropes are coiled. Keels remember how to follow stars away from anger. On the plain, a wooden shape waits for morning and the slight pride of a city that believes in gifts. The gates open because gates are made to open. A priest speaks a warning in the exact tone warnings need and is answered by a net of voices that do not like nets. A serpent's story is told even as it happens. Most stories are. Rollers are placed. Ropes are thrown over shoulders. Boys run ahead to shout that it is almost in the square. There, under the calm eye of the gods carved on lintels, the great thing that is not a statue learns to be patient. Night comes with the slow mind of summer. Fires go down to their low red thoughts. In a wooden room, men keep the kind of stillness that breaks wrists. A door opens on the inside and makes no sound. Steps that have practiced this step since the idea was first drawn on sand take it without looking down. The city that has been a school for endurance walks through the last hour of its old name. No one needs the catalog. Lamps are put out not to save oil, but because dawn will be brighter than the neighborhood wants. Hands find what hands always find when lists are short. The shoulder of a child, a jar that will not rattle, a door that has learned the way out. The beach sees the returning keels and remembers to be cruel and then to be calm when the work is over. Somewhere inside the tangle, an old man sits on a step and names his sons in order and reaches the end of the list and does not know what to do with his hands. Somewhere near a gate, a woman ties a bundle with thread that has mended more than cloth. The wind moves the smoke and then tries to put it back where it was, as if the world could be tidied by weather. When day has done what day will do, Ash writes a paler copy of streets that will not be walked again. The horse stands in a square that no longer has a name. The sea, which has always been honest, admits the ships that left and the ships that return, and the people who will go home and try to forget, and the people who will never leave the water because the water is now their only map. A singer later will take a deep breath and decide where to start. Not at the apple, not at the first sail. He will begin in the middle, because that is where most lives feel true, and he will trust the listeners to carry whichever beginning they prefer and whichever ending they can bear. We call him Homer to keep the story tidy. He calls on a muse to keep the story gentle. The rest is a long tide that keeps turning pages. We have walked from a room with no names to a city full of them and watched those names go back to quiet. We have set stools on a mountain and learned how rules sit down. We have carried an ember in a careful stalk and watched a house learn to behave. We have counted seasons by a mother's patience and a daughter's 2 homes. We have followed errands that ended in folded cloaks and clean tools. We have watched a ledger fill with 12 small marks. We have seen a wooden thought wait for morning. You do not need to hold any of it in your hands. Let it pass like slow weather across your ceiling. Breathe in as if the sea were filling under a hull. Breathe out as if a watchfire were lowering itself for the night. The gods will keep their seats. The roads will keep their width. The hearth will remember its small round voice. Close your eyes. Let the world turn the page for you. Sleep.